Hi, everyone. I appreciate that this is day 2 of a subject matter rich engagement during a season of many engagements. And it is Saturday night, and the sun is set. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to try and crack as many jokes as needed to keep you with us for our conversation this evening about immigration justice and future building. So the way that we'll run is we'll give our panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves and provide some context about what we're bringing to this conversation. We're going to ask each other questions and share answers, and then we'll reserve some time right at the end for questions and answers. I'll flag that some of our panelists do have other work-related engagements after this and do need to get up and leave to drive to those. So thanks for bearing with us. We're coming as we are and doing what we can. Without further ado, I'm Jill Martin-Diaz. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Asylum Assistance Project. We are a legal services and technical assistance organization. Our vision is that every person in Vermont knows their relevant immigration and related legal rights and knows how to access them and is able to access them. I am joined by an incredible panel of folks who I've worked with in lots of different ways over the last year. And a lot of us are not here really just in our capacities in our day jobs. There's a lot of different ways in which we have all done work together this year, focused on not just meeting this moment of pursuing immigration justice, but also building a future. What are some immediate steps that we should take, and what are our long-term goals? So we're going to take a second to let our panelists introduce themselves. I will ask my panelists to please share with us, how are you showing up today? And what are you bringing to this conversation in terms of your day work, your projects that you're working on, your passions, your experiences, whatever. And I will tell you that I am showing up today really happy because I took a nap. Treasurer Pichak, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Pichak. I'm the state treasurer for the state of Vermont. Also helped co-found the Vermont Immigration Legal Defense Fund back in May as well, which we'll be talking about today, and also had the really great opportunity to work with Jill this year when we established in our office the Federal Transition Task Force, thinking about all of the different ways that the federal government and specifically the president was going to change federal policy and how that was going to impact the state of Vermont. You know, I'm showing up, as I think I have for the last 10 months or so, ever since we've been in this moment, with a mixture of feelings, both, you know, being very anxious for what this moment means, being somewhat terrified about what this moment means, as well as I imagine a lot of the folks in this room are. I often answer the question, how are you doing, with I'm great except for everything, because that's sort of how this moment feels. But I'm also just coming back from being with some fellow state treasurers, Democratic state treasurers in Washington, D.C., and we had a couple of days of meetings where we were talking about the work that we're doing collectively as state treasurers to invest in our home states, invest in housing, invest in infrastructure, invest in workforce, invest in our economies, how we're doing that by putting people first, focusing on the middle class, working class across our states. We are always strongest when we're working together. We had a lot of discussions with organized labor while we were down in Washington, D.C. as well. Their movement is as strong as ever. So that's filling me with a little bit more joy today as I'm thinking about and reflecting about those meetings and visits that we're just coming back from.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Dolan, and I am the director of the State Refugee Office with the state of Vermont, and I'm so happy to be here. And I am showing up today feeling hopeful, which is not always how I feel, I'm going to be honest. I swing wildly day to day, actually. Some days I can't sleep and wonder if I am part of something terrible, and then the next day I feel great. So that's how I'm showing up today, feeling hopeful. I'm also showing up as a proud mom today. My oldest daughter competed in Vermont's semi-finalist Funniest Comedian contest last night, and she did great.
Nice.
Yes. And my youngest child, who often feels very nervous, went to a gathering where they didn't know very many people today and stuck there for a full 2 hours without calling to be rescued. So feeling like hopeful and feeling like a proud mom today. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Janu. I work as the Economics and Policy Lead at a global organization called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And I'm also a fellow at New America, which is a think tank in DC focused on economic security. And I would say I'm showing up right now with quite a bit of relief. I met Jill doing, giving like a VLI training, the Vermont Leadership Institute training on the economy. And when I was asked to speak on an immigration justice panel, I was a little worried that my background as I guess I would describe as a radical economist might be a bit afield. But I've been loving listening to everybody today, and I think a lot of the themes around the importance of having more clarity around our vision, of more upstream interventions and preventative action, more focus in community and the things that really matter most, are a lot of thematics, which I'm looking forward to discussing with you all.
Hi everyone, you may be sick of hearing from me today since it is the third time. I'm so sorry to still be here, but my name is Monica Allard, or Mo Allard. My pronouns are she, her. I am a staff attorney with the ACLU of Vermont, and despite it being the end of the day, I am showing up just incredibly invigorated. Our last panel over in Conant on disability voting rights access was just incredible. And I think I too feel moments of utter dejection and moments of real hope. And the moments when I feel the most real hope are when I take that first step and just start doing something. And so thank you all for being here. I'm sure that you are people who do things all the time, but I'm excited for this to be another one of those first steps that propel us all into motion. So thank you so much. And I also want to mention that I'm stepping in here today for my colleague Hillary Rich, who's also a staff attorney at the ACLU of Vermont. She focuses primarily on immigrants' rights issues. I do not. Nevertheless, I'm here with her remarks again, and so give me some grace as I read to you off the screen. Thank you.
Yeah, but what? Test. Yes, but Mo, what very famous, amazing immigration case have you worked on?
And yet, at the ACLU, we are generalists, and so I have done some immigration rights work, including representing both Rumisa Ozturk and Musa Madawi, and thank you, who are both incredible, and I'm also a VAP evangelist. They're doing incredible work over at the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, and everyone should support them.
Oh, shucks. Thanks, Mo. I want to start by echoing thanks for the Human Rights Commission. A small organization like Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, or VAP, every time we take attorney time that is theoretically designated for representing non-citizens impacted by this enforcement climate, and we take some of our attorney time and we instead direct it toward community education and outreach and advocacy, it's a special investment. We have pretty limited resources to be able to do stuff like this. We don't have the resources to coordinate legislative breakfasts. We'll have pretty limited bandwidth to do one-on-ones with our amazing representatives. So many of you are here today, and thank you. I'm sorry for all the texts and emails I owe you, but that's why I think it's so great that we're all here together now, because this is a really incredible platform for all of us to dialogue with each other about what our goals are going into this next session and also an election year here at our state. So just thank you for creating this container, and we would love to come back again and again and again. To make sure that we're all coming to the conversation with some shared understandings of what we're talking about in the immigration system, I've been asked to make sure I do a couple of terminology, definitions, some background, so bear with me if you've heard me do this exact spiel many times. This year, a lot of folks have been reaching out to us for Know Your Rights training, right? We need to know our rights. And I think that if the most frequently asked question we get at VAP this year is, what do we do if ICE shows up at blank? Then the question I tell them to ask me, which they're not aware of asking me, what do I do when ICE violates the rights you taught me at blank, right? So that's the hidden second question that I want to make sure audiences understand, because that is absolutely part and parcel of the practice. Sometimes as a result of good faith errors, perhaps. A lot of times as a result of recklessness and indifference, and even more frequently, intentionally, is what we're seeing in the field. So what do I do if ICE shows up at blank? What are my rights if ICE shows up at blank? What do I do if ICE violates my rights while showing up at blank, right? And then the next most frequently asked question that we get is, how is that legal? How is that allowed? How can we be allowing this? And so I want to just set the stage for folks who are newer to immigration justice, who are coming to these issues of the U.S. immigration system, maybe for the first time this year, maybe last year. I do think it's this moment. I'm really, my heart is heavy for all of the people impacted who aren't here in this room because it wasn't safe for them to get on the highway and drive here, because they don't know if we've taken the precautions needed to know what to do if ICE shows up here at this auditorium, right? But I want to say that the first thing we can all do if we are in allied positionality is use this opportunity to not only educate ourselves and each other, but leave it better than when we started this moment, right? Make lasting change for Vermont. And so yes, the immigration system has always been rooted in authoritarianism and racism and extractive capitalism. The first US federal immigration laws were created during an immigration wave from China of Chinese laborers coming to the US, and as Chinese laborers were getting married and having kids and buying property and wanting to fly over to China to visit family and then re-enter, that's when the former slave owners running our government, they were like, we need to create a system where we can't just allow this workforce, these visiting workforce who are people of color, to have access to the whole shebang, right? Because what is citizenship if not the right to have rights? If you are not in citizenship status in the US, you're somewhere else on this continuum of maybe some kind of temporary immigration permission or status, maybe permanent residence, which is a misnomer because it can be taken away. Anything less than citizenship means you don't have a right to the full bundle of rights. We are allowed to violate your rights. You don't have the same rights, you don't have the same remedies. And that was created to maximize corporate profits, because if you have a permanently subhuman working class of people who don't have all of the rights, then it's really easy to maximize profit at their expense. And this is how the US immigration laws began to form. And the Supreme Court found that because immigration touches on national security, that over the hundreds of years, the governments decided that immigration is the national interests at stake supersede somehow the civil and individual rights at stake. And that's okay, and that's allowed. And in fact, whiteness was the #1 threshold eligibility criteria for citizenship until the 1950s, right? And that's the foundation that this system comes from. So how is that allowed? This is happening by design, right? And so the other piece I want to share with you is that in terms of what's changed this year, no laws have changed. Right, the Refugee Act passed in 1980 created our current asylum-seeking system as we know it. There have been little changes to corners of the immigration law over the years. This year, the Lake and Riley Act passed in January. It expanded the list of people whose prior criminal history makes them mandatorily detainable by ICE. Again, you didn't understand that jumble of words? You don't have to. It's a pretty niche issue. Laws haven't changed. What has happened is that this system of delegated authority and authoritarian discretion that's unchecked by other branches of government, like this system has just been sitting there waiting like a bomb to be detonated, right? These are powers that have just been sitting and have fallen into the wrong hands. So on the one hand, things haven't changed. And on the other hand, I think that this is our call to action to change it. We are now more aware than ever before of the dangers of the system. Oh, I'm supposed to stop for that applause. Yes. But, so that's what we're walking into this year. What are we seeing? We're seeing mass arrests, massive violations of individuals' rights. We're seeing we're seeing the other branches in the states maybe being courageous in ways like they've never been before. And we had to act pretty quickly. Right now, our federal funding was pulled in February. We then sued the government and now it's being reinstated. But they came for us first, right? This idea of first they came for the immigrants. And I'm watching some of our nonprofit colleagues in other sectors now have a discussion, start to reflect on, well, what do we do if the federal funding is pulled? What do we do if, what are we going to do in the State House? Let's all just go ask for all the money, even though there's not going to be as much of it. So I think that what I can offer from an immigration justice perspective is this idea that we have actually had to move really quickly and creatively at this table and with all of you in our communities to survive this moment. And I think it's an interesting case study because it doesn't stop here, right? The Trump administration is scapegoating immigrants for a larger purpose, I would argue an economic purpose. And I think that this is a cool opportunity for us to sit and think about what we learned and to dream. So I'll turn now to the ACLU, to the wonderful Monica Allard, or Mo if you're nasty. The session description posits that Vermont has a long record of advancing civil rights, and in 2025 has shown national leadership by responding quickly to new federal immigration enforcement measures. Mo first, and then anyone else who wants to chime in, can you walk us through a little bit how Vermont is responding to this moment, and how our rapid response this year tracks with Vermont's history of advancing civil rights?
Yes. So it is true, like you've already touched on, Jill, that this moment feels really uniquely perilous for non-citizens and for immigrants, and to everyone, like all of us who are here trying to build a more inclusive and multicultural democracy. And at the same time, like Jill mentioned, it's important that we place this moment in context and realize that the United States has this long history of discrimination and enacting punitive laws against non-citizens. So the breadth and the tactics that are being used in Trump's anti-immigrant agenda, Trump 2.0, might be new, but the animus really is not. And this disclaimer is important not to invalidate the fear and the urgency that people are feeling, because we want to use that urgency, that sense of urgency is real and important, but to encourage us to resist that paralysis, because we've seen administrations target non-citizens before, and we've learned from those experiences, and we've learned how to fight back. What we know is that it is true that the president has a lot of power over immigration, but that power is not unlimited. He's still bound by the Constitution. He's bound by constraints that are established by Congress and by specific procedural requirements for certain policy changes, as well as restrictions that are set by the courts when we challenge those overreaches. There are also ways that states can and should push back, even though we often think of immigration as a federal issue. So while the federal government has the authority to decide who can have or pursue immigration status, states have the ability and the power to decide how much immigration status should impact a person's ability to meet their basic human, safety, and economic needs. What does it mean not to have citizenship status in the state of Vermont? And Vermont has stepped up in this regard before. In the past few years, we've seen state-level solutions that remediate some seemingly intractable federal problems. So for example, while some states are facilitating local law enforcement's collaboration with ICE, here in Vermont, we have a fair and impartial policing policy that prohibits that kind of cooperation. This model policy was created by the Criminal Justice Council, and it restricts how our state and local police can share information and access with the federal government. On top of that, Vermont has taken steps to make our roads safer. And instead of placing unnecessary restrictions on non-citizen drivers, Vermont created a non-discriminatory driver's privilege card, a license that's available to any Vermont resident that does not require proof of status. And to renew that card, you don't need a proof of, all you need is proof of residency, and even a utility bill is sufficient. Our legislature has worked to ensure that everyone can access justice in the courts, though still working on that one. But in 2022, Vermont passed a law that prohibits arrests at courthouses unless law enforcement has a judicial warrant. So that's recognizing that no one should have to fear arrest just by participating in the judicial process. And most recently, in the last legislative session, Vermont made further strides by making sure that immigration status is not a barrier to our basic human right to housing. This past session, Vermont expanded protections for non-citizens seeking housing by barring discrimination based on citizenship or immigration status. And the legislature also recently created a new standby guardianship for non-citizens and mixed status families. So now if a parent is detained by immigration authorities, instead of having their children taken into DCF custody, they can designate a trusted adult who knows their family to take custody of their child and facilitate their reunification. All of this to say that when it comes to immigration, states too often have this knee-jerk reaction that it's not our lane, that's a federal problem. But there are a lot of things that the state can do, not to settle into inertia, but to really engage our creativity and strengthen our existing laws and policies. And later on, I have a suspicion I'll have a question where I can tell you a little bit more about what those potential policies we could adopt might be.
Awesome. So the next question's for Amanda. When we got together to plan this discussion, we wanted to think through, well, if immigrants aren't the problem, you heard it here first. If immigrants aren't the problem for our perceived scarcity of resources and this myth of a scarcity of rights, that there's like a limited number of rights to go around, we gotta marshal them. Our question for you is this: as the federal resources continue to shrink and political attacks on our rights increase, Vermont must decide how to protect its values and plan for the future, to defend rights and sustain key programs, even in a time of federal austerity. Given your focus on future building, through the lens of the well-being economy and at the international level you're working at with maybe lessons learned from other places, are there frameworks available to help guide Vermont in the difficult conversation ahead about scarcity?
Yeah, lots of big questions there, but maybe by way of beginning a little more context. So I grew up in South Stratford, Vermont, and I would always go to our town meeting with my parents and listen to my parents and neighbors debate and decide on everything from how much money should go to the road crews or to school lunches to whether or not there should be GMO labeling on food. And that was my introduction to politics, my introduction to economics. So you can probably imagine my horror when I went to college and learned that there were a bunch of people who thought that the economy was governed by its own natural laws and not by us. And that really is what started my now decades-long love-hate relationship with economics, because I really think that one of the greatest tricks that's been played on our society is to present the economy as some abstract force out there beyond our control, when the reality is that we are the economy. The economy is just a word for the way we produce and provide for one another, and we have a right and a responsibility to mold and direct that system in line with our values and objectives. But the issue is that, particularly since the 1980s, we've sort of accepted that the primary goal, not only of the economy, but of our society and government, is economic growth and stock market values. And so we went about encouraging and rewarding the large investors, corporations, and tech entrepreneurs who were viewed as the most efficient at generating and supporting that growth, trusting that if we removed them from any democratic oversight and left them to their own devices, that the profits and wealth they generated would benefit us all, right? And Republicans promised it would trickle back down through increased investment, job creation, and cheaper goods. And Democrats pretty much embrace the same logic, except promise to take some of that wealth through taxes to fix any major damages done to people and planet in the process. Now, obviously, neither of those scenarios happened, which is how it's possible that in the richest country in history, in terms of GDP or economic growth, 60% of Americans aren't even earning enough to afford basic needs like housing, healthcare, food. And so we ended up with this situation where, you know, when people have lost trust in government and democracy, so when Trump says that democracy is a failed experiment and we should just accept being ruled as a corporate monarchy, it doesn't actually seem that crazy, because studies have found that since the 1980s, there has been a net zero statistical correlation between public opinion and public policy, meaning that the laws that go through Congress are not influenced at all by public opinion. They are entirely influenced by the interests of corporate lobbyists and economic elites, right? And so I think it's important to say then that, like, people are calling for change. Like, the threats of fascism are very real, but also Benito Mussolini once said that fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism because it is a merger of corporate and state power. And by that definition, we've been on this train for a little while now. And so people are calling for really fundamental transformations of our political and economic system. And so the threats of fascism are real, and the threats to our democracy are real, but if we are going to save not only our country, but the world from this onslaught, we've got to do a lot more than protect the status quo. And the good news is that people also, they recognize the problem, but they also see the solution. So even in the US, potentially the most capitalist-loving country in the world, 68% of Americans believe that our economy should prioritize the health and well-being of our people and nature rather than profit and wealth, right? And that is the foundation of the well-being economy movement. It's about recognizing that people and planet are not here to serve the economy. The economy is here to serve us. And I work for an organization that helped to establish the Well-Being Economy Governments Partnership, which is a coalition of 6 governments, national governments, that was first instigated by 3 quite small governments, New Zealand, Iceland, and Scotland, who all had female heads of state at the time, I'll just note, which I don't think is a coincidence, who recognized that our current economic system is generating so much inequality, natural disasters, an epidemic of loneliness, anxiety, and despair, and that the increasing frequency and severity of these crises have meant that even the richest countries in the world can no longer afford to keep just responding to these crises and putting out those fires, and that they're gonna have to move upstream and get the economy do more of the heavy lifting in terms of delivering on social and environmental outcomes. And so, so my favorite example is probably from Wales. So Wales went through a process of asking their citizens, what kind of Wales do you want to leave for your children and grandchildren? And on this basis, they developed these 7 high-level well-being goals, which were all around equity, health, global responsibility, social connection, cultural expression, and even their definition of resilience was around biodiversity, and their definition of prosperity was innovation and creativity, but within planetary boundaries. And they passed this really revolutionary legislation that required a whole of government transformation in line with those goals, and required that all of government not only had to set clear indicators related to those goals, but to set clear 25-year targets, so for the next generation, that they would be held to account in achieving, and created a Future Generations Commissioner whose tenure is always longer than any political administration or cycle to hold the government to account. And so what this meant was that, for example, when they wanted to build a new highway through the country, the Future Generations Commissioner at the time, Sophie Howe, was like, okay, well, explain to me how that's going to contribute to our 7 goals. And when they couldn't make the case for contributing to any of the goals except for maybe one, they put a permanent freeze on all new highway development so that money would go into public transportation and active travel, which they could clearly see as contributing to a more equitable, globally responsible, healthier Wales, et cetera, right? And so I'm part of this coalition called the Vermont Prosperity Project, or actually, we're rebranding at the moment to be the
hot off the press.
Yeah.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, to be the Well-Being Economy Alliance of Vermont, or WEAVE. And we brought Sophie Howe to Vermont a couple years ago to meet with our legislature, and Mike actually provided the closing, because we really believe that Vermont can lead the nation in this kind of thinking and advance a type of legislation like this. If we ever get Phil Scott out, yeah, I think we have a hope here. And so, you know, I moved back in 2018, not only because, like, my dad is an immigrant, right? So when the Muslim ban started, I knew that this is the standard fascist playbook, is always to scapegoat immigrants and the most vulnerable populations for the pain brought by laissez-faire capitalism. But I specifically moved back to Vermont because not only is my home, but it's the reason I believe that a different political and economic system is possible. And I feel like kind of a Republican now because my only hope is states' rights. Yeah? Like, this is a moment when we really need to lean into our federalist structure and to advance, like, stop reacting and be much more proactive of having states act as a real challenge to this authoritarian shift, but also to live up to their promise as being living laboratories of democracy. And so here, I think we can lean into this very unique tradition we have of direct democracy in our town meetings and engage our population in clearly defining our long-term goals, but also of creating multiple coalitions. So my dream is something like a well-being economy governments of states, like a coalition of a few states that I hope Vermont can lead the way with, to actually create a strategy of multi-state political resistance. And so, like, Mohsen Madawi earlier was talking about divestment, for example. If you even had a few states threaten to divest from their pensions the companies that are just, let's say, on the list of the ballroom funders, you would end up creating a huge amount of influence in terms of undercutting the federal administration from that power. Or earlier, Alyssa was talking about the Fund Vermont Future Coalition, which I'm a part of as well, and who's trying to advance this fair share tax. And even if we just advance an 8% increase, for example, on people who earn more than $500,000 a year, we would have more than enough to fund a universal primary preventative health care system. We could bring back local doctors to communities. People wouldn't have to pay for primary or preventative care, and we would fundamentally, potentially, I mean, estimates vary, could save up to $1.8 billion over the next decade. But it requires longer term and preventative thinking. And so my hope is, and my call here is, that we can really be, you know, if hope is built in resistance, let us be that hope for the country and for the world. Thanks. Oh, yes. Do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're pivoting on the fly, you see. I really, really appreciate both of you kind of framing up this conversation in the ways that you did, of saying, well, okay, so there's a problem, and Vermont actually has a history of showing leadership among the states in solving these kinds of problems that are seemingly intractable. And then Amanda's just shared with us some opportunities of, like, well, what could we be working toward? If we don't want to be approaching the rest of our existence from a scarcity mindset, how do we start to plan now for a future we want? I'm excited to hear from Tracy and Mike now, because I think immigration justice and, you know, the immigration climate that we all find ourselves in, it really illustrates a need for two-tier thinking and action simultaneously. There's what can we do today to solve today's problems ASAP, like tomorrow, right? There's like the immediate harms. How do we remediate immediate harms for the people most vulnerable and impacted? But then there's also, let's not lose sight of the future and get so caught up in fighting today's battles that we can't dream for what we want to be in 10 years. And so first we'll start with the here and now. I'm curious, Tracy, to hear a little bit from you, your vantage point, what you see in the sector. What are some of the effective here and now strategies that you've seen play out in 2025 in our state?
Thank you so much. Glad to be here and to talk about this. I think that when we see what's happening at the federal level, it's easy, well, I'm going to say it personally, it's been easy on some days to feel a paralysis and to almost slow down the work because you're just waiting for the next hit. In my work, the impact of this administration is literally felt every day in some new way that doesn't always even make the news. You know, there are quiet things happening on the regular that are impacting immigrants, impacting primarily Black and brown people in Vermont, and that really run, have kind of white supremacy running through them at all times. And so small examples, small here, but huge for some people. You know, you may not know that on September 29th, there was a new rule that came out from the Department of Transportation. As of September 29th, refugees, asylees, and asylum seekers can no longer apply to get a commercial driver's license. They were always able to do that, and we have commercial drivers here in Vermont in those groups. And we have employers desperate for commercial drivers, right? September 29th, that all stops. These are just, and I'm guessing a lot of you probably didn't know that. That's a massive impact on an industry and on human beings. And so those are some of the examples of, you know, the moments where it feels like, oh, I've got to put all my energy into making sure we get that message out. I need to talk to DMV to even understand that. What are all the pieces that we need to know? Is it impacting people right now, et cetera, right? And so what Jill talks about is that looking down and seeing a future where we will have a little more room to be able to respond in a way that makes sense. And so that is kind of the lifting up of the head that's really important. I wanted to speak specifically to a couple of key pieces I think that are important. Preface all of this by saying, as much as I think the way to move forward, I liked what Mo said, sometimes you literally just have to do something. You know, you have to take the step. And that is what helps me, and I think that's what's helping and working in the refugee immigrant community a lot. I mean, people saying, whatever the federal government is doing, I got to worry about tomorrow, so I'm going to make my next step go forward. But with the backdrop of, we do have to call out what's happening wherever we can in our own sphere. I need to call out the white supremacy that's happening in the refugee resettlement program federally. And I need to do that in a way that allows me to still stay in the room and be part of the conversation. So that's one of the kind of personal leadership challenges I have. But there are all kinds of ways that we do move forward. One of the themes I want to highlight is relentless follow-through. My background is public health. I was the deputy commissioner at the health department for years. And smoking is a real scourge in our country. And the average smoker tries to quit about 13 times before they quit. That is relentless follow-through. That's a brutal addiction, and it's very hard to quit. And so they'll try the first time. Maybe the timing wasn't right. The second time, maybe they're not around the right people. The third time, maybe they didn't use the right method. And I think about that when we do this work. It's going to be easy to sometimes feel like, I tried, I'm going to step back. Well, maybe we need to try at a different time with different funding in a different conversation. Or maybe we take part of the policy we want and hitch it to another policy. But we keep the conversation going, and I do believe that's how we get wins. I'm going to give you some, thank you. Oh, thank you, Gary. Okay. I'm going to give you, just a very small practical example. Here in Vermont, we have refugees arrive who often have a lot of skills in particular professions. We've had folks arrive who have nursing backgrounds, but because of licensure issues, they can't show up and be a nurse. But maybe they want to restart and become a licensed practical nurse. We have exams for licensed practical nursing, and those exams were entirely in English. For some of the folks who were arriving, what they really needed was some interpretation at those exams so that they could complete the exams. They had the skills, there was just some language barriers. And our exams weren't provided in any other language, so there was a real stop there. And so folks were looking at it and bringing it to me as an issue. So I reached out within the state of Vermont to find out what was happening, and I was told, oh, well, the vendor that we use to proctor the exams only provides them in English. I said, okay. So I went to the vendor, and I said, I understand you only provide them in English. And they said, well, yeah, that's because in our contract, it doesn't ask us to provide them in other languages. And I said, oh, do you do that? And they said, oh, yeah, we provide them in lots of languages in other states. And there was no ill intent. Sometimes people just haven't thought about it, you know? And I would say, you know, I'm going to be kind and say they haven't thought about it, but we know that the institutional racism prevents us sometimes from thinking about it, right? So I go back to the state of Vermont and say, hey, actually, they do it. They just don't do it with us. And then state of Vermont says, oh, actually, well, the contract is coming up for renewal. Maybe we can put that in, but the Board of Nursing would have to agree. I said, okay. And because we're small in Vermont, I got on their meeting within 7 days. And Board of Nursing was thrilled. They're like, you know, we have a nursing shortage. They're like, that sounds like a great idea. Unanimously, yes, do it. And so the state of Vermont put out the new contract. It now allows for translation, you know, and there's still obviously little issues that we need to work through, like communicating this over and over and over so it actually happens. But those are small examples of the next point I'll make, which is, it's true, there are some policies that are preventing us from doing big things, but within what we've got, we can do more. We have the flexibility. We don't always stretch and use the whole sandbox, but there's a lot of room in that sandbox to do more than what we're doing. And sometimes it's a matter of just bringing it up and then bringing it up another time, and maybe with another conversation, or with another person, or at a different time, or linking it to another, you know, policy, but it's that relentless follow through. So I think we can do a lot with what we have, while at the same time, at that higher level, continuing to call out what we need to do differently. I'm just gonna highlight one more important thing. We have a lot of resources in Vermont, in particular, the humanity, you know, the attitudes in Vermont. UVM does a Vermonter poll. I think they do it every 2 years. One of the questions they ask about is refugee resettlement. And Pablo Bose is part of the Vermonter poll, and he presented a couple of months ago. In the last poll, 83% of Vermonters responded yes when asked, do you think we should continue refugee resettlement in Vermont? That's a pretty big mandate. I'm guessing that goes beyond probably refugee resettlement. That was the particular question. But those are examples of the resources. We actually have an environment where we can do more, and it's just a matter of continuing to be creative, continuing to bring energy. And I am so lucky, I feel, in Vermont, both within the state. I would say this administration has given more support to refugee resettlement than any administration that I've ever been aware of. I regularly am asked to brief the governor on refugee resettlement, and he asks detailed questions. I've had flexibility with state funding. We've never had state funding for refugee resettlement ever until right at the beginning of COVID. And I feel like there's a lot of interest. So those are all resources. Other parts of state government, agriculture, the agriculture commissioner, it's not a commissioner, he's a secretary. You know, he calls up and says, what can we do? And I say, we don't have enough halal food. And he goes back to his team and says, hey, can we do something with one of our grants to generate more halal production here? So all kinds of resources, and we just have to keep working on it. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. Since I omitted a quick term definition at the beginning that I'll just raise in case folks are new to the distinction. So the scarcity myth that we led with has led to a whole bunch of different classifications of immigration statuses, right? These legal fictions that decide how many rights you have and inevitably how many resources you can access. And the scarcity myth, as Amanda pointed out, this is a bipartisan critique, has led us all to just normalize the idea that that it is normal and appropriate and necessary to pit subpopulations against each other. And so I'll just name, when you hear the term refugee or asylee, what that means is a person who went through a legal process outside the United States that took years and years and years, sometimes decades, and then ultimately, after securing their refugee or asylum protection, were resettled here in Vermont. In many cases, Vermont has gone over, we welcome a disparate per capita rate of refugees here in Vermont. And then there's everyone else who, any other person who has a fear of return, they have a right to be heard on that fear. If they're here in the US and they say, I'm afraid, that's the end of it. And those people are what we call asylum seekers. And there isn't a legal definition for when someone actually starts their asylum seeking. But anyone who hasn't exhausted their right to be heard, in my book, is an asylum seeker. And note that those people are people that have not gone through a legal process yet, often due to our own bureaucratic hurdles, and those are folks who don't have any rights. They have no right to have any rights and don't have access to resources. And so one thing that we've done this year that's been really amazing, and that I know Tracy's here as an administrator, so let me be the advocate and just say thank you to you for leading the Office of New Americans Study Committee this year. So last legislative session, we joined partners, many of you in this room, to see Act 29 passed, and along with support from the Federal Transition Task Force, we wanted to take advantage of this political moment, this awakening around immigration and justice issues, to say, hey, we as a state, we don't need to play into the scarcity myth that pits subpopulations of immigrants against one another based on what a legal status they do or don't have. We can say we want everyone to be people, we want everyone to have rights, and what we want is state-level responsibility for coordinating the providers and the advocates who work in that space. So that is what the Office of New American Study Committee right now is doing, a study for this year, reporting to the legislature next fall to inform the state what would it look like for us to pull out of that, this subpopulation false dichotomy, and to start to look at the well-being and belonging needs of all of our non-citizens in Vermont, all foreign-born people in Vermont, without regard to status. And so thank you very much for leading that study. And thank you very much to Mike for being a champion of the bill during the Federal Transition Task Force. So I'm curious to hear from you, Mike, about what are the lessons learned when we think about some of the quick action that we took as a state this year in our state house to create better mechanisms for coordination and better outcomes, for the administrative advocacy that Tracy alluded to that we've done to open up new lines of legal services for people most impacted, and the ACLU, as we mentioned briefly, although this isn't about litigation, bringing lawsuits that are leading the nation in our federal district court here in Vermont. What are the lessons learned, Mike? What are you thinking about with respect to immigration justice and a future well-being economy for Vermont?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jill, for the question. I think where I want to start before getting to the specifics is just thinking about what is the lesson about the value that we want to have in Vermont. What kind of Vermont do we want to have? What kind of values do we want to express as a community? And for me, it harkens back to why I got into public service in the first place, to build that kind of Vermont. It's the example both of my parents set, but I just want to talk about my mom. My mom set this example for me very clearly at an early age. She was highly involved in the Brattleboro community where I grew up. She was volunteering all of the time. But she found her life's work, her passion, when in 1982 she founded a soup kitchen called St. Bridget's Kitchen in Brattleboro. She worked and led that soup kitchen for over 40 years. They started by serving 12 people on St. Patrick's Day in 1982 and now serve over 45,000 meals a year in and around Brattleboro. And when I was a little kid, she would take me with her regularly to deliver food to people in the community. I was regularly with her at St. Bridget's while she was volunteering there, or I was helping her. And I saw the way she interacted with really folks in the Brattleboro community that had largely been forgotten about or shut out or shut in, elderly residents, residents that were down on their luck, residents that had something really terrible that it happened to them. They were trying to fight back and come back from. And no matter who my mom was interacting with, every single time she showed them love and care and patience and respect. And it instilled in me this idea, this value that in Vermont, everybody matters, everybody has value, and everybody deserves dignity. And I think that is the high standard as citizens of our state, as community leaders in our state, as public servants, that we should be holding ourselves to and trying to live up to. And if we're trying to build a state where everybody matters, our new American population, our immigrant population, has got to be at the top of that agenda. It's the top of the agenda for moral reasons that we've been talking about. It's the right thing to do. You can even go back to the Bible that talks about strangers in a strange land and welcoming people in. That was our moral imperative, because we were strangers once as well. But it's not just a moral issue. It's quite clearly an economic issue for our state as well. It couldn't be clearer from a dollar and cents perspective. New Americans are powering the Vermont economy right now. They will power the Vermont economy in the future. If our economy is going to be successful, if our state is going to be successful, it'll be because we've created a Vermont where we have been welcoming in more new Americans than our counterparts in New England and other parts of the Northeast. And we've created those same policies and environment that allows and new Americans want to stay in our state. That is how we will be successful in the future. So when I think about what are the lessons we've learned over the last 10 months or so, one I learned during the first Trump administration. You have to be proactive, and you have to be coordinated, and you have to be collaborative. You have to be working every day trying to share information, trying to understand what the latest situation or federal policy change is. It's basically the things that you need to do in a crisis. When you're in a crisis, you need to be proactive, you need to be coordinated, you need to be communicating. You need to make sure people have the same information, that everybody knows what each other's doing, and that you have a shared purpose and a shared mission and you're moving forward. I can think about examples in the first Trump administration where I thought we weren't as proactive, and we got caught flat-footed when there were these fast-changing federal policies. It's why we established this Federal Transition Task Force to try to stay ahead of some of those changing policies. But whether it's across state agencies, or whether it's the state government with the federal delegation, or the state government with the for-profit or nonprofit sector, we have to be in constant communication. I think that's really critical. The other lesson, I think, is one that is for those in public office, but also for for citizens as well, which is you have to be innovative and creative at this moment. There is no active leadership that is outside of our job descriptions at this moment. There's no active leadership that's outside of our moral imperative of citizens at this moment. You have to find every way that you can to stand up and push back and be part of that effort to resist what is going on with the federal government and try to build the Vermont and really broadly the country that we want. It's why, even though it has nothing to do with being the treasurer of the state of Vermont, I felt so passionate about establishing the Vermont Immigration Legal Defense Fund in May. The way that the federal government is treating our neighbors is deplorable. These are neighbors that I mentioned are critical to the Vermont economy, but they're critical to our communities. They provide cultural richness, they are good neighbors, they provide diversity and different perspective, and that they were going after the most vulnerable really just felt like so evil and cruel, and also so weak on their part as well. It's easy to go after people who are vulnerable. So all of us that have some level of authority and power and privilege, I thought we had to do what we could to stand up and try to build that legal infrastructure to support every single Vermonter so that no one faced deportation alone when they were targeted by the federal government. I'm excited that we just crossed our halfway point. We set a goal of raising $1 million. We've raised $500,000. We're taking a breath on that. $500,000 from about 1,200 people. Really, it's a lot more because we partnered with the Vermont Green, and they were great in expanding the awareness of this mission. We provided 2 different grants, totaling now $200,000, the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project. We've provided grants to the Vermont Afghan Alliance, to the Association of Africans Living in Vermont. We have a lot more work to do, but we're starting to put in place some of that legal infrastructure to make sure that everybody has their day in court and they have a lawyer by their side, because as we all know, immigration proceeding is really, really challenging. So I think that idea of being innovative and creative in all of the ways that we can, whether through our official roles or as members and leaders in society. The last thing I want to mention is that infrastructure piece. So legal infrastructure is important, but it's also important that we broadly think about that infrastructure that's going to welcome and encourage new Americans to come to Vermont and want to stay here as well. So that infrastructure expands to things like housing, things like workforce, economic opportunity. And those things would be best served, in my opinion, by establishing an Office of New Americans that can serve as a coordinating entity across our state. It should be our competitive advantage that we have all of the policies and all of the resources and all of the coordination that we can as a state to welcome in and encourage new Americans to come to Vermont, to choose to live here, to choose to encourage their family to follow them and come to our state. It's how we will get stronger. It's how we will address our demographic issues. It's how we will build an economy that is powerful and works for everybody. But that will continue to take leadership on all the folks in this room and our legislators, but I think that is a really important thing to highlight, that infrastructure to create that opportunity that will provide that economic security that we need for the future.
Thank you, Mike. And on behalf of the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project staff and board, several of you are here. We operationalized out last year with me as the only paid staff. I was the first paid staff at VAP. I was one attorney, and now we are a team of 11 people. And we're in the facilities, and we're in immigration court all the way in Louisiana. And so we really thank you for your leadership on this issue.
And Jill was doing the work of 11 people at that time, so now it's just there's more people there.
Well, I've just hit my 1-year anniversary. It's 1 year since Election Day, and that is when I stopped sleeping, and I took a nap today. Look at me, being involved. No, I really appreciate that point. And so a few quick things, and then I'm gonna pass it back to Mo. To help us think ahead to the next session, the legislative session. There's not another panel, don't worry. The legislative session before we open it up to questions. So yes, just a quick note for folks who are already thinking this, I just want to name it so that this isn't a distraction and we can stay engaged in the high level, amazing ideas that are being exchanged here. When I say I lobbied for an Office of New Americans equivalent for Vermont, I use the term New Americans because that is the term that is used nationwide to describe state government level offices that do this kind of coordination, and it's a shorthand that we've all adopted pursuant to the statute. But believe me, we're all very, very sensitive to the fact I'm a Latina person from South Florida and I grew up in Central America, and lots of people are American besides people from the US. And so rest assured, we'll have so much time. That's what the study is for. Tell the study committee what name you think the office should have. But I just wanted to name it because it is in all of our consciousness, and it's something we've all talked about. And I'm the one that was really pushing, let's get the bill passed, whatever it's called, who cares? We need this. Because to belabor Mike's point, what Mike is saying so bears out with my experience as an immigration lawyer in this moment. Oh, what do we need to be effective? We need to be bold. We need to exercise our powers as a state. That means no to preemptive compliance. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. You can't hide how blue you are when you're currently suing Donald Trump. I am currently in a lawsuit against Donald Trump. There are certain people in this office in this room who are currently in a lawsuit against Donald Trump. So there's nowhere to hide. Everyone knows exactly how Vermont we are, and we need bold leadership rather than silence and creative and preemptive compliance. The idea of coordination, like a style of leadership, you described it as like top-down of coordination. What we have experienced in the immigration service sector this year was that a culture of silence and siloing and decentralization, due to the obvious lack of state-based coordination, has thwarted resources. Like, we are having to spend a lot of resources that are supposed to be for service delivery, trying to organize ourselves so that we're not stepping on each other's toes and causing harm. Right? It really is felt. I'm like, we did amazing this year, and imagine what we could have done if we were organized, right? And then the final piece is this idea of like infrastructure for well-being. What does it look like when we have leadership, both in our state house and in our government, that is helping us to think through not just, okay, what dollars do we need to fund right now for today's emergencies, but how do we set ourselves up for a future Vermont that we want to be? And fortunately for me, who, as you can clearly tell, I was called to the mission of this work for humanitarian reasons and also like political ideology reasons. I'm a rule of law nerd. And then when I started to study the dollars and cents this year, as we all need to be doing right now on any of our issues, I was very relieved to discover that immigration is good for the economy, that Vermont has a population cliff, and that we need to be proactively getting ahead of what's happening at the federal level if we want to have some good foundations left to rebuild in whatever comes next. So speaking of whatever comes next, the ACLU of Vermont has very generously offered they have a strong lobbying and communications program at their office, and they have offered to be a leader in terms of cultivating and doing outreach on recommendations from immigration service providers to the legislature this session. And I would love for Mo to preview for us what we are recommending.
Absolutely. Hearing from you all, it made me think that one of my favorite compliments that I've ever received was from a person in power who called me an extraordinary nudger, putting it in my Instagram bio. And there are so many extraordinary nudgers at this table. And if you all want things to nudge on, I have some ideas of how you can be so annoying. So first off, there's one piece of legislation that would be an absolute game changer in our state. And our call is to provide state-funded access to immigration counsel for people in detention. So when Jill was talking about how some non-citizens have no rights, caveat, some of our rights, like the First Amendment rights, are supposed to be for all of us, right? But the right to counsel when you are being held in prison for immigration detainees does not currently exist, which means that you could be held for years in deeply unsafe conditions, and you're not entitled to a state-funded attorney. You may not even know that you have a right to pay for an attorney or how to access one. And you could be navigating essentially a life or death situation in an obscure court process, maybe in a country you're not familiar with, maybe in a language you're not familiar with, in a language you don't understand, without a lawyer. And that is just so contrary to everything that we're all advocating for here today. And unsurprisingly, statistics demonstrate that detained non-citizens who are pursuing their immigration cases with attorneys are exponentially more likely to receive orders of renewal if they don't have one. So it makes a huge difference. And the state already provides public defenders to people who are charged with criminal violations. And we propose that Vermont expands this framework to fund immigration attorneys for people who are civilly detained here in Vermont. The Trump administration is actively stripping away any semblance of justice from our immigration system by creating legal and procedural hurdles for non-citizens in detention proceedings. And excuse, my dog is licking my hand and preventing my ability to access my notes. She is also an extraordinary nudger. You've heard so much about this detention apparatus, right? This deportation apparatus. And a bill like this that provides a right to counsel would strike a powerful blow against the federal government's apparatus and show that Vermont protects due process and the rights of its residents. On top of that, we're also advocating for improvements of conditions in detention and for the removal of barriers to medical and legal services. So part of the state's justifications for renewing the DOC contract with ICE that you may have heard about recently was that conditions in Vermont prisons are so much better than places in Louisiana and Texas. But there are advocates in this room who access those facilities on a weekly basis and have seen that this is not always the case. There are people in detention who do not speak English and are unable to contact their families or their attorneys. And when VAP is going into these facilities on a weekly basis, they're learning about people for the first time. There are people that no one knew that they were even detained, no one knew that they were there because they didn't know how to contact their attorneys, they didn't know how to contact their families, they didn't know that they could even use the phone because there's not adequate language access. People in detention are having their needs not met even with respect to basic medical care. Some of them don't even have access to clean water and have resorted to melting ice. Our state is falling woefully short of meeting our moral and legal obligations to people in its custody, and so we're calling on the legislature to change that. A third proposal is for legislation that safeguards our community spaces. So starting in 2011, ICE issued guidance that limited immigration enforcement in places of worship, in schools, and in hospitals. But in January, the Trump administration rescinded this guidance, leaving people afraid to fully participate in daily community life. This means that people are afraid to send their kids to school, they're afraid to access medical care, and they're putting those things off to the detriment of their health and their families. We're advocating for legislative change that would prohibit ICE from gaining access to places like schools and state agencies without a judicial warrant, and model policies that empower business owners to assert their rights on behalf of their employees. So in private places, private people have the right to refuse access to ICE without a judicial warrant. We want to reclaim that sense of safety in our community spaces that prevent people from fully participating in public life. And we want to prevent ICE from commandeering state buildings and resources to effectuate its anti-immigrant agenda. So my hope is that some of the people in this room can help support these legislative proposals, either directly as representatives or by calling on their representatives, sending letters, providing crucial testimony. And we can also do our part by continuing to show up for each other. So we've seen how effective protests and community activism can be. There's a lot of energy in this moment. There's a lot of people who are waking up, who are having that tear gas moment that Wilmer talked about earlier, to the rights of non-citizens and the issues that are impacting them. And one of that moment for a lot of people was when Mosa Madawi was detained in April. There was this real outpouring of love and support for him with protests outside the courthouse and across the state. And the court moved very quickly in that case and rightly demanded that the government justify detaining Mohsen. And when they couldn't justify it because it was in direct retaliation of his First Amendment rights, the court ordered his release on bail. And that's just like a direct impact that we see when we show up, when we get loud and we come together, that people listen. And attorneys and multilingual advocates have a role to play also. There are other attorneys in this room, and there are people who speak other languages in this room. By mobilizing volunteers, VAP has been rapidly expanding its training and its services, and every time VAP is able to get a client released from detention, that not only benefits that individual, but their family and the entire community, and it slows down the deportation system for everyone. And you can be a part of that if you have language skills or if you have legal skills by volunteering at one of VAP's weekly detention site visits. So stay in touch with them, get on their newsletter. I'm going to keep evangelizing about this because, yeah, everyone has a role to play. And finally, I want to say that we can also support each other by sharing good information. The rate of misinformation, specifically around non-citizens and around ICE activities, is just wild right now. So make sure that you're getting your information from reliable sources. Make sure that you're not just sharing things that are scaring people for no reason. And instead of perpetuating rumors, we're taking a moment to check our facts so that we're disseminating information that is really actually going to help people. So use the ACLU website, use the BAP website, American Immigration Lawyers Association, or AILA, the National Immigrant Justice Center, National Immigration Law Center. All of these are reliable, good resources. And finally, again, I just want to echo Jill's point that we can all urge our state actors not to preemptively comply with the Trump administration's inhumane and unlawful policies. They have done real harm, but they have also overpromised what they can do. And the only way that Trump can fully deliver on that promise is if we help them by behaving as if our rights have already been stripped away. So we can encourage our legislators, our private actors, our leaders, and each other to hold that line. We only have the rights that we act like we have. So that's my spiel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. We only have a couple minutes left, and so I'm going to exercise moderator privilege. And I am going to invite Amanda and Tracy, and then Mo, if something else springs to mind, to give us your 1 minute closing. Like what's the thing that you wish that you said, or what's come up for you since you first shared your remarks, just to give us some parting thoughts as we close for today.
Do you want to go first? Sure, I'll go first. Yes. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to see the growth of VAP. That's been exciting, the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project. And I think about 3 years ago, I got a call from Jan Steinbauer. She heads up the Chittenden Asylum Network. And she called, and we had some state money. And this is an example of be bold and ask your questions and bring forth your ideas. She said, can we access any of those funds? Because I think a lot of folks thought, probably rightly so, that a lot of the money in the refugee office was only for refugees. But we had state money, and the language in the legislation allowed us to be more flexible. And so we talked about more funding for initiatives that help asylum seekers, so going bigger than refugees. And thank you so much for Jill for mentioning that. But she also said we need legal coordination. And so that was the first time we started having that discussion around what would broader legal coordination do. And so we were able to actually provide some state funds and some federal funds creatively. I think this is the creative piece to get some of that, those things going. And that's just an example of, I think if you have ideas and you think that idea is not going to work, ask and begin the conversation, because you never know what direction things are going to go in. So I think my final piece is continue to come to the table, continue to have the conversations, because I think there are great relationships in Vermont, and they can bring us far.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a number of things I guess I've been reflecting on here, and I think one of the important points for me is in the work that I do, I think the biggest paradigm shift that we can all embrace is we've all become so accustomed to this sort of economic supremacy that makes us feel like we need to make the case for why health is good for the economy, for example, rather than swapping that burden of proof and asking, how is the economy contributing to our health, right? And so it's the same thing with, yes, immigrants are important contributors to our societies, but their value, I don't believe, can be quantified in a financial indicator. And so very much about swapping that idea. Yeah. And so for me, the problem, I think, so much of, if I can encapsulate this, is that our government is functioning to the point around revenue that the only way we just treat the economy as the way we get revenue, that then we can use to fix some of the damages that were created by the economy, right? And so the point here is that if we are clear on what are the goods and services we really need to ensure to all people, what are the basic protections, do we have the people And do we have the resources, right, in order to ensure that provision? And so right now, the reason why I mentioned the medical care is so as part of the Fund Vermont Future discussion, we are in a bad situation. Like 30% of our budget comes from the federal government, and it's almost all for our broken medical system, right? And so we will capitulate to Trump unless we have a strategy to ensure that all people are provided with basic medical care. And the thing is, it's actually not that expensive if we just paid primary care physicians directly as opposed to this fee-for-service whole structure, right? And so some of it is around like, what are those fundamental needs that we believe that all people are entitled to? But we all need to agree on that, right? So when it comes to housing, similarly, we've heard about in the past session, the need for us to really decommodify certain aspects of life and recognize that these are rights and they are not investments, right? And I think this is where, once we have embraced this idea, and I think if we have a real shared vision about our commitment to one another and our natural environment, that provides us with a moment and the courage to be aggressively generous right now. And so if, people who have more money, great, share it. People who have a lot of skills, because Vermonters are very handy, right? Like, we need that too. We all have, I think, a contribution to give in this moment, but only with that can we be clear that, like, together we have everything we need, and that there is no price at which we are willing to sell our neighbors to ICE. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. And for my final say is, please do subscribe to the VAP newsletter. We will be continuing to publish substantively on what major changes are actually happening, right? Myth busting, separating out some of that misinformation with reliable information. We'll be sharing with you what we learn about how, what options in front of the state next year would help serve our client community's interests. The truth is, as I hope we've illustrated tonight, from my perspective in the immigration defense world, this isn't a partisan issue. The Vermont Legal Defense Fund has really been championed by representatives, leaders from both sides of the aisle who are motivated by some combination of the many social, political, humanitarian, democratic, and economic interests that are at stake. And we can hold the complexity and just think about what we want to do, right? It is very true, and I am grateful for how VAP has benefited from Governor Scott's investment in immigrant subpopulations in addition to refugees at the state level. It is also true that Governor Scott's policies and practices around the Department of Corrections has obstructed efficacy of our legal services, and that we really have spent a lot of our supporters' time and money trying to fix, baseline access issues instead of doing the fight. But when we do get to do the fight, we use the roadmap set by ACLU and Mosen and Remeza's case, and little old us, we walk into federal court, and most of the time, we win. So thank you for your support. We can do this. Year one down. Thank you. Woo.
So we have time for some questions. Does anybody? Oh, okay.
Hi. More of a statement and an expression of gratitude. Been here all day, and this applies to all the panels. And I'm not surprised to be inspired because I know most of you, but the amount of hope that just kind of permeated this space over the past hour has been just incredibly uplifting. At the end of the panels, a lot of us have been asking, what can we do? What can we do? We hear, call your legislators. And true, as a legislator, please do call and get to know us and reach out on a personal level and say, these are my expectations of you, petitions, all of that. I just want to state what we need. We need a new administration. And I told Mike this privately, and I told him I was going to do this if I had the opportunity. I need him to run for governor. No apologies to him. And Amanda, your first time you're on my radar, that was amazing, and I want to hear more and more from you. And we're going to need a new treasurer, so please.
Yes! Now we're talking, Troy. What else? More of that.
Hi, you guys are amazing, so thank you. And Jill, you stole my thunder because I was going to say new Vermonters, please. I was going to sing the La Segunda Independencia about how we're all Americans in this continent, but you did it, so we're good. But I do want to propose new Vermonters or something, or add it to the conversation about new Americans, because I think it's, I work with a population that is, until CBP 1 was opened, would never have had a chance of having any status, and I feel like they're often invisible and should be brought to the table, especially now. You're probably aware that the major healthcare program that we run is without funding, and our program that does education will probably be without funding come June. We were kicked off the docket with English language and after-school programs and migrant ed, and then there was some high-level lobbying in Republican states with agriculture to make the argument that we serve an economically beneficial population, right? And so it's back on the, it's back till June, but I think those things are going to be lost. And then I had just a couple of questions. So I am aware of the CDL change because I happen to be married to a CDL driver. And so one of the things that we were commenting, how are all the French log truck drivers going to come and cross the border in Vermont? So I'm wondering if Vermont might consider, like, the next driver's privilege card, which has been so important for access, might be a Vermont attempt at a CDL in which you might be restricted to in-state. It would allow drivers coming from Canada into the state, but it would also open up a whole population of people who could take all those jobs driving our school buses and driving, Reinhardt's trucks from southern Vermont to et cetera. So I think that would be an interesting thing. And my other question was related to town meeting. I also grew up at my parents' knee at town meeting, and I come from one of the first towns that voted on the floor to take away the floor vote, and we now vote by Australian ballot, particularly around education. And I've seen that happening a lot. Like, we still vote about whether or not, we're going to give the road crew a raise. But I can see the argument about participation and the difficulty that people have getting to town meeting, taking away the floor vote and our ability to legislate from the floor. And so I'm just wondering how we address that at a state level. And I want to note that since education is often the biggest thing that happens at town meeting, and education has been struggling and under attack since Act 46 and now Act 73, it's going to be harder to get people to come out as they lose their schools, or, like in our case, we no longer have a town school board, so everything feels more far away, and you almost have to vote by Australian ballot. So I'm just wondering how you guys think, what can we do about that and the CDL thing?
Yeah, I'll take that second half of that question, because I just came out of the whole last panel, which was all about that. Like, the whole panel was all about how we need the universal Australian ballot here in Vermont for town meeting day, because it is so inaccessible for so many people and cuts so many people out of the democratic process. And that is something that can be done on the state level instead of requiring a floor vote in order to get an Australian ballot, and thereby continuing to exclude all of the people from the same conversation. So I don't know, big are these?
I would. Yeah.
The problem. So I love participation, but what we have a right to do right now is legislate from the floor. And the only way you can do that is by showing up. So we could work with the tools we got from COVID and allow people to participate from Zoom. We could carpool better. We could offer meals. There's a lot of stuff we could do. Or you lawyers could come up with a way that we could legislate from the floor. But if you go strictly to Australian ballot, we've lost the citizens' ability to make a change at the local level. I can literally stand up and say, I think Jill sucks, and I want them to be docked $5 of pay because
She doesn't think that.
I don't think that at all. But I could, right? Like, as you know from going to South Stratford, that's the type of crap we get into at town meeting. Until our ability to legislate from the floor is gone. And then all you can do is stand up and bitch and moan, and and no longer change anything on the ballot. So it's a slightly different way of looking at it.
Yeah, there are incredible advocates who are working so hard on this exact issue and have so many creative solutions that allow for that same level. And towns around the state are already taking steps that still allow for this level of floor participation and an Australian ballot. Like that is, those solutions are in the works and available, and I really, really cannot commend to you enough the panel that I just got out of, which is why I want to go back to our dear friends at the HRC and ask, these are recorded, right?
I would like to add here, because I think that I have a much deeper love of the floor vote process of the town meeting, because it's old school, like Rousseauian democracy, deliberative democracy, to your point of people getting into it. And if somebody's, like, well, I don't have any kids, why do I have to pay for school lunch? You're just like, shut up, Tom, sit down, Like there's immediate accountability, and there's something really powerful in that process. And I know there's a lot of criticism of it because, yes, it happens on a Tuesday, and, only a small percentage can go. But that's also, we could, to your point, right, like, actually change the day to a weekend, or we could also provide free childcare and financial support for people to attend, meals and other ways in which to ensure that more people are participating. And also, to me, what's really important, because right now we're seeing the danger of too much power by the state or the government, right? And so I think it's very important that we go through participatory processes of being clear where we want to go, and then redistributing a lot more power back to towns and communities in order to actually develop strategies that make sense for their context on how to get there. And so this is, for me, about redistributing power within a genuinely democratic system. And so I know a lot of people are like, oh, town meeting, but I think it's actually the foundation for like a much more exciting democratic system moving forward.
Yes. And everyone should be able to participate in it. And please go watch that panel. It's so good. It's so good. You're going to love it.
And this is Big Hartman. Hi, everyone. I'll just say that the panels that you weren't able to attend today they are all being recorded by Orca Media, and they're going to splice them together with the slides, and we will be able to distribute recorded sessions, so you can even go back and see some of the stuff that you already saw, and also check out some of the panels to see, especially the perspective of people with disabilities. Not having access to town meeting is a genuine barrier and a concern for inclusion. And that's all I'm going to say on that for now.
If I can just speak briefly to the New American versus New Vermonter issue. So just to let everyone know, each meeting that we have on this Office of New American Study Committee, which again is not normally what we call all of our immigrant Vermonters. A lot of us say New Vermonters, but for the purposes of the committee, it's that name. All of those meetings are public, and we would love to have you listen in. There's an opportunity to comment at the end, and probably in a few months we'll actually have some meetings where we dedicate to some of the language. There's all kinds of cool names out there. Michigan calls it Global Michigan, for their office. So we don't have to stick to even naming an immigrant population. We can talk about what the purpose of the office is, but really want to shout out that you are welcome. If you go to the office, the State Refugee Office website as part of the Agency of Human Services, the meetings are listed there in the link, and you can just come into the meetings. Thank you.
I think we should let you all go eat now. But I so appreciate you. Thank you so much for being so amazing, and on a Saturday night, you're so good. Thank you, Big. Thank you,
This has been incredible. Thank you for this wonderful discussion today to close out an amazing day. A lot of us have been here since 9 in the morning talking about civil rights, and there's so much enthusiasm, and I see how welcome folks are at having these conversations together. So I'm really grateful.